Welcome back to my channel. Today we will learn about the issue that has shaken the very foundations of ABC's General Hospital. In this tragic turn of events, the once quiet suspicions surrounding the elusive Cyrus have erupted into a full-blown crisis. Law enforcement stands on the brink of finally gathering the evidence needed to apprehend him for the murders of Sam and Dex, along with other mysterious hospital-related deaths. Cyrus, once hopeful of escaping prosecution by hiding behind a facade of reform, now faces the looming threat of arrest and the potential collapse of his carefully orchestrated deceptions. In the frantic hours before justice closes in, Cyrus orchestrates a swift and brutal plan of revenge, culminating in the shocking death of Joss, an innocent victim who becomes the tragic pawn in Cyrus's final act of defiance. Let us recount the events in detail, focusing on the most critical developments and their implications for the characters of Port Charles. Several weeks earlier, a quiet sense of dread began to take shape when authorities received growing indications that Cyrus might be behind multiple unsolved homicides, including the deaths of Sam and Dex. Though no ironclad proof had yet surfaced, scattered clues told a haunting tale of clandestine violence, each thread pointing back to Cyrus's dark presence. Among the staffers and patients in General Hospital, rumors circulated that Cyrus, still maintaining influence in the medical underworld, had orchestrated the deaths of certain individuals, particularly those who threatened to expose his clandestine activities. Some of these victims were unsuspecting hospital patients, while others had once challenged his attempts to regain control over Port Charles's criminal underbelly. The evidence was circumstantial at first, insufficient for a formal indictment, but the whispers among those who had encountered Cyrus's ruthlessness refused to die. Then, everything changed when the police began to piece together a more complete picture. Through painstaking research, testimonies from employees, and a re-examination of prior investigations, officers began to compile a coherent body of evidence that linked Cyrus to the murders of both Sam and Dex. Cyrus was said to have encountered Sam shortly before her death, and Dex's body was discovered under suspicious circumstances that pointed to a targeted killing. Although Cyrus offered no confessions or direct statements, his name kept surfacing in connection with unexplained anomalies at the hospital, leading detectives to suspect he had systematically eliminated potential whistleblowers or adversaries. The net of justice was slowly closing in. Somewhere in the shadows, it appeared that Jason and Joss had taken it upon themselves to gather crucial evidence confirming Cyrus's guilt. They worked discreetly, meeting with potential witnesses, collecting digital traces, and recording incriminating conversations that Cyrus believed were hidden. According to those close to the investigation, Jason, long known for his fierce protective streak and ability to operate beyond the official channels, had quietly enlisted Joss's help for certain tasks. Perhaps Joss was adept at ferreting out details from unsuspecting sources, or perhaps she merely found herself drawn into the quest for justice because of her personal sense of moral conviction. Regardless, the end result was that newly obtained documentation, testimonies, and forensic scraps were delivered to the police. Although not an open and shut case, it was enough to raise the probability that Cyrus would soon face arrest. Word of this development reached Cyrus in short order. Realizing that his carefully constructed illusions of innocence were unraveling, Cyrus's anger and paranoia spiked to a dangerous level. He fixated on Jason and Joss as the primary culprits behind these new revelations. Two individuals he believed had worked in secret to ruin him. Until recently, Cyrus had attempted to project a saintly image. He had claimed to turn over a new leaf, focusing on philanthropy or spiritual redemption after his stint in prison. But the threat of impending arrest left him no room for half measures. He believed that fleeing Port Charles was his best chance at survival, but first, he insisted upon punishing those he deemed responsible for orchestrating his downfall. From there, Cyrus devised a simple yet gruesome plan. If he could not remain in Port Charles without facing prosecution, he would at least exact vengeance on the people who had aided the police. It was no secret that Jason was a formidable target. Jason's combat experience, allies, and unwavering readiness to retaliate made him a challenging opponent. Indeed, Cyrus reasoned that attacking Jason head-on might prove suicidal or simply impractical. Instead, Cyrus chose a more vulnerable target, Joss, a young woman who lacked the protective networks and lethal training Jason possessed. Cyrus's plan capitalized on seizing the one moment when Joss was alone, circumventing any of the defenses her family might have rallied around her had they suspected an imminent threat. In the fateful hours preceding Joss's murder, Cyrus carefully watched her movements. Despite being aware that the police might soon attempt to arrest him, Cyrus kept his focus on revenge. Some accounts place him lurking near one of the more secluded sections of Port Charles, waiting with a determined calm for Joss to pass by. The details remain sparse, but what is certain is that Joss found herself isolated, perhaps coming home from an errand or heading to meet a friend, when Cyrus, armed with a knife, pounced. He attacked swiftly, giving Joss no chance to call for help or defend herself. The savage act lasted mere seconds, ending in tragedy as Cyrus delivered a fatal stab wound. Joss collapsed, blood pooling around her, her life extinguished almost instantly. Leaving Joss's body in the silent alley or street where the assault took place, Cyrus fled into the darkness. In the immediate aftermath, the scene remained hushed until passers-by or neighbors recognized that something horrific had transpired. Within minutes, emergency services and the police arrived, only to discover Joss's lifeless form. Confronted with the brutal finality of the crime, the authorities wasted no time initiating an investigation into the homicide. However, no one doubted the identity of the murderer. Among the heartbroken men and women of Port Charles, the mere mention of Joss's name in the context of an act so abhorrent seemed inconceivable. The shock and anguish rippled through the entire community. News of Joss's death quickly reached Carly and Sonny, both of whom were intimately connected to her. Upon learning that her daughter had been murdered, Carly rushed to the crime scene, tears streaming down her face. She was overwhelmed by regret, recalling that Joss had been deeply involved in trying to gather evidence against Cyrus. Carly lamented that she should have intervened more forcefully, or perhaps that she should have convinced Joss not to participate in any plan that might put her in harm's way. The heartbreak of losing a daughter in such a senseless manner left Carly sobbing uncontrollably, her grief matched only by the guilt that gnawed at her conscience. Sonny, similarly devastated, fought to maintain composure while grappling with an urgent desire for retribution. In the midst of this heartbreak, Jax, Joss's biological father, was informed of the tragedy. Residing in Australia at the time, Jax received a phone call that changed his life forever. Upon learning that Joss had been murdered, he reportedly went silent for a moment, unable to process the news. Then, spurred by paternal love and heartbreak, he booked an immediate flight back to Port Charles to claim his daughter's remains and participate in the funeral. The emotional toll of traveling across the world to bury his only child was unimaginable, saturating each of his steps in sorrow. Arriving in Port Charles, Jax found a city reeling from this shocking crime. The sight of Joss's mother inconsolable, surrounded by officers discussing the homicide, underscored the stark reality that his precious daughter was gone. It was in the swirl of his grief that Jax made a discovery. Not only had Cyrus murdered Joss, but he was also responsible for Dex's death, a revelation that ignited a fresh determination in Jax's heart. Dex, in some accounts, was deeply cared for by Joss or had ties to Jax's extended circle. For Jax, the knowledge that the man who had killed his daughter was the same man behind other senseless killings was intolerable. He resolved that he could not merely stand by and wait for law enforcement to bring Cyrus to justice. The weight of heartbreak spurred him to vow vengeance, to avenge Joss in a way that might be more personal, more direct than letting a trial unfold over weeks or months. Amid this swirl of sorrow, chaos, and the blossoming thirst for retribution, the funeral of Joss took place. In the subdued lighting of the memorial service, Jax, Carly, Sonny, and countless friends and loved ones gathered to say goodbye. Eulogies spoke of Joss's bright spirit, her warm heart, and her willingness to stand up for what she believed was right even at great personal risk. Floral arrangements, tearful condolences, and long embraces underscored the tragedy that had befallen a young woman who had her entire life ahead of her. Carly, in particular, found it almost impossible to forgive herself for what she saw as an insufficient effort to shield Joss from danger. Meanwhile, Sonny offered an unspoken vow to the memory of Joss, perhaps a vow that justice would be served in one form or another. In the wake of the funeral, Jax's quest for retribution seemed unstoppable. Yet, he was not alone in his fury. Sonny, known for his own code of justice, simmered with the desire to see Cyrus pay for the monstrous crime. Carly, still consumed by grief, began speaking of the need for closure, if not vengeance. Even the police, who had thus far lacked the final piece of evidence needed to lock Cyrus away, found renewed impetus to speed up their efforts. This time, spurred by the murder of an innocent young woman, law enforcement soared into action with uncharacteristic swiftness, convinced that if Cyrus remained free, more lives would be lost. Cyrus, too, had not yet slipped away into obscurity. The plan to flee Port Charles was urgent, but in dispatching Joss, he had drawn attention to himself in a manner he could not afford. Police, crime syndicates, and vengeful parents alike turned their eyes upon him. The city was abuzz with talk of the manhunt that would inevitably follow. Some speculated that Cyrus had arranged for a clandestine path out of the country, perhaps forging documents or calling in old favors from those who still feared or respected his underworld reputation. Others guessed that Cyrus might change his face or disappear into a remote corner of the globe, living under a false identity. However, every time a rumor about Cyrus's whereabouts surfaced, the collective rage and sorrow of Port Charles grew more pronounced. Now the city stands on the brink of a second confrontation. Jax's vow to avenge Joss is matched by the unwavering determination of those who loved her, from Carly to Sonny and beyond. The question is whether legal justice can catch up to Cyrus before a more primal form of payback materializes. Dante and other detectives remain locked in a race against time, meticulously working their sources in an attempt to locate Cyrus. The newly uncovered evidence that established Cyrus's role in Sam's and Dex's murders now overlaps with the murder of Joss. If enough proof can be assembled in a timely manner, then perhaps the manhunt's success might see Cyrus standing trial for a chain of brutal killings. But if official means falter, then personal vendettas threaten to eclipse the law, as Jax, devastated by the loss of his daughter, may take matters into his own hands. Such is the disquieting state of Port Charles in the aftermath of Joss's murder. A once lively young woman has been cut down in an act of vengeance intended to silence the revelations that threaten Cyrus's freedom. A father flies across oceans to bury his child and to unleash his own brand of justice on the man who stole her future. A mother weeps endlessly, haunted by images of the path not taken, the warnings not given, and the bitter regrets that churn in her heart. A policeman stands on the cusp of collecting enough evidence to secure an arrest warrant, though each passing moment grants Cyrus additional opportunities to evade capture. And all around them, the city holds its breath, waiting to see whether the next bullet or the next knife thrust will claim yet another innocent. Ultimately, this tragedy underscores the fragile balance between justice and sorrow in General Hospital's storyline. Cyrus, having once appeared unstoppable, now faces the imminent collapse of his illusions, but at the steep cost of an innocent life. Joss's murder stands as a horrifying testament to the vengeance of a cornered predator, lashing out in desperation. The final act of this grim tale remains unwritten, for the threads of heartbreak, retribution, and potential redemption twist together, leaving the characters in a precarious limbo. Will Jax's thirst for revenge overshadow the pursuit of lawful justice, creating a scenario in which vigilante action exacts a penalty that the courts have yet to impose? Or will the police finally piece together the last puzzle fragments, cornering Cyrus with overwhelming proof and thereby bringing him to face the consequences of his monstrous acts? As fans of ABC's General Hospital, we watch with rapt attention, grappling with the emotional implications of Joss's tragic passing. We see how a single moment of unguarded vulnerability invited the darkest evils to strike, leaving behind heartbreak that defies description. We brace ourselves for the funeral proceedings that embody the weight of Jax's grief, Sonny's silent fury, and Carly's crushing guilt. And we ready ourselves for the next chapter in this sorrowful chronicle, in which those left behind must determine whether justice, be it legal or personal, will serve as a salve for the wounds inflicted by Cyrus. In a series known for its dramatic twists and shocking revelations, The Murder of Jos has ignited one of the darkest arcs yet, confirming that in Port Charles, tragedy can intrude on life at any moment, irrevocably changing the destinies of every character it touches. In conclusion, the chain of events triggered by the discovery of evidence against Cyrus has ended in a devastating loss, the death of Jos, a young woman who found herself at the wrong end of Cyrus's twisted vengeance. The immediate futures of Carly, Sonny, and especially Jax are now defined by grief and the desire for retribution. Meanwhile, the police scramble to solidify the final pieces of a case that might put Cyrus behind bars before he disappears from Port Charles or strikes again. The entire community stands in mourning, grappling with the hateful finality of Jos's murder, and the knowledge that any illusions of safety have been shattered. Whether Jax can find closure by personally confronting Cyrus, or whether the law will bring Cyrus to justice, remains the question on everyone's lips. For now, heartbreak and outrage reign supreme, as a once vibrant life is extinguished in one cruel, fatal moment. Stay tuned for more updates as this sorrowful and urgent storyline continues to develop.